Configuring Azure Active Directory authentication for Azure SQL performance tuning is a crucial step in optimizing the performance of your database while ensuring secure access. To begin with, it is essential to understand the basics of Azure Active Directory and its role in authentication. Azure Active Directory, commonly referred to as Azure AD, is a cloud-based identity and access management service that allows users to access various Azure services, including Azure SQL database. The first step in configuring Azure Aad Auth for Azure SQL performance tuning is to create an Azure AD tenant and register your Azure SQL server with the Azure AD tenant. This involves navigating to the Azure portal, selecting the Azure SQL server you want to configure, and then clicking on the Active Directory option. You will then need to select the Azure AD tenant you created and follow the prompts to register your Azure SQL server. Once you have registered your Azure SQL server with the Azure AD tenant, you can create Azure AD users and groups and grant them access to your Azure SQL database. This is done by navigating to the Azure portal, selecting the Azure SQL server, and then clicking on the Firewalls and Virtual Networks option. From here, you can add the Azure AD users and groups you created and grant them the necessary permissions to access your database. Another key step in configuring Azure Aad Auth for Azure SQL performance tuning is to configure the connection string for your application to use Azure AD authentication. This involves specifying the Azure AD tenant ID, client ID, and client secret in the connection string. You can obtain the client ID and client secret by registering your application with Azure AD and creating a client secret. In terms of best practices, it is essential to ensure that you are using the correct Azure AD authentication mode for your application. There are two modes available: password-based authentication and certificate-based authentication. Password-based authentication is the most common method and involves specifying the username and password in the connection string. Certificate-based authentication, on the other hand, involves using a certificate to authenticate the user. To optimize performance, it is also essential to ensure that the Azure AD authentication is properly configured to minimize latency and optimize throughput. This can be achieved by configuring the Azure AD authentication to use the correct protocol and cipher suite. Additionally, it is essential to monitor the performance of your Azure SQL database and adjust the configuration as needed to ensure optimal performance. In conclusion, configuring Azure Aad Auth for Azure SQL performance tuning is a critical step in ensuring secure access to your database while optimizing performance. By following the steps outlined in this guide and using the best practices, you can ensure that your Azure SQL database is properly configured to use Azure AD authentication and optimize performance. This will help you to improve the overall security and performance of your database, while also ensuring that you are using the most up-to-date and secure authentication methods available.